Imagine demanding half of a $6.4 billion bridge that your country already co-owns, that another nation fully paid for, and that you never invested a single dollar into, as if ownership could simply be declared at will. That's exactly what happened when Donald Trump made his extraordinary claim over the Gordy How International Bridge, a bridge fully funded by Canada and already legally co-owned 50/50 with Michigan. The White House was caught so off guard that for 72 hours it couldn't produce a single coherent response. This wasn't a normal trade dispute, nor a diplomatic standoff. It was a demand built entirely on misunderstanding, a demand for credit, materials, and ownership that America already possessed, all delivered with the certainty of a man who hadn't read the contract he was challenging. And then the Canadian Prime Minister did something simple but devastating. He walked to the podium, held the contract in his hand, and read it aloud, clause by clause, dollar by dollar, point by point. The effect was immediate. The White House went silent, completely silent. 3 drafted responses were abandoned because none could rebut the factual claims without confirming them. The Gordy How International Bridge isn't just any crossing. It's the longest cable-stayed bridge in North America, a 6-lane marvel connecting Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. Its towers, soaring 220 meters above the river, were designed to resemble hockey sticks, a tribute to Gordy How, the Saskatchewan-born legend who spent 25 seasons with the Detroit Red Wings. 2,000 days of construction, 98% complete, and a price tag of 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, paid entirely by Canada. Under the 2012 crossing agreement, the bridge is co-owned equally by Canada and the state of Michigan, with toll revenues split once Canada recoups its investment. Understanding what Canada actually built, what the agreement specifies, and what Trump demanded is crucial because it highlights why insiders called these 72 hours the most embarrassing of his presidency, not for losing a negotiation, but because there was never anything to negotiate. Canada paid the bill. The receipt is $6.4 billion, and yet the demands persisted. The absurdity becomes even clearer when we look back at Trump's own words. In 2017, he praised the Gordy How Bridge as a vital economic link, calling it a symbol of cross-border cooperation and a project he fully endorsed. Fast forward to 2026, and the same bridge, with the same materials, the same ownership structure, and the same agreement, becomes the subject of demands for compensation and credit that were already addressed years ago. Imagine admiring a house at an open house and months later showing up after the closing to demand you live there for free. That's the scale of the disconnect. And this week, those demands shocked diplomats, baffled trade lawyers, and left the White House communications team paralyzed because they weren't just wrong, they exposed a complete misunderstanding of the facts. Every claim about ownership, compensation, and materials was already settled by the existing agreement. And when Mark Carney, Canada's former central banker, read the contract aloud at a press conference in Ottawa, the silence was deafening. Carney's method was simple. He read the contract aloud, dismantling each of Trump's claims with plain facts. Trump demanded that the United States own at least half of the bridge, ignoring that Michigan already holds 50%. He demanded compensation for costs never incurred, overlooking that Canada funded the entire project. He claimed the bridge contained virtually no U.S. content, despite American steel and labor being integral to its construction. And he suggested that a Democratic president had waived regulations when in fact the agreement was signed by a Republican governor and adhered to standard procedures. Every single claim crumbled under the weight of documented reality. Carney paused at the podium, letting the silence speak volumes before delivering the summation that would be quoted worldwide. The U.S. already co-owns the bridge, already benefits from the investment, and every demand had been preemptively addressed. The only explanation for Trump's demands, Carney implied, was that he had never read the contract. This wasn't political theater. It wasn't negotiation strategy. It was arithmetic and reading comprehension. And the audience of reporters understood immediately that they were witnessing an event that would dominate headlines for years. A calm, factual demonstration of contract law had rendered the most powerful man in the world silent, powerless against facts and numbers. Canada had invested $6.4 billion. The U.S. invested zero. The Gordy How International Bridge stood as a monument to cross-border cooperation, engineering excellence, and economic foresight. And yet, it became the backdrop for demands that made no sense, because the arithmetic is unforgiving and receipts, unlike rhetoric, cannot be negotiated away. Let's break down exactly what happened at that press conference, because the sequence of Trump's demands and Carney's factual responses reads like a masterclass in accountability. Demand number one, Trump claimed the United States should own at least half of the Gordy How International Bridge. On the surface, it sounds like negotiation, but the contract tells a different story. Carney opened the agreement and read aloud. The bridge is already jointly owned 50-50 by the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority on the Canadian side and the state of Michigan. Michigan, part of the United States, already co-owns exactly half. The demand wasn't a negotiating position, it was a statement made in ignorance of the facts. The President of the United States was demanding something he already had. Demand number two was even more perplexing. Trump stated he would not allow the bridge to open until the United States was fully compensated for everything we have given them. Carney's response was simple but devastating. Compensated for what? Canada paid every dollar of the $6.4 billion construction cost. Zero American federal money was spent. Michigan contributed land and regulatory cooperation in exchange for ownership and a share of toll revenues, which would kick in only after Canada recouped its investment. The math is clear. Canada invested $6.4 billion. The U.S. paid nothing. Yet the president was demanding compensation for costs that never existed. Let that sink in. The U.S. was essentially asking for a reward on top of an already extraordinary gift. Half ownership, operational jobs, and long-term revenue, all free. Arithmetic doesn't negotiate. Numbers don't lie. And yet, here was a sitting president acting as if they did. Demand number three focused on materials. With Trump claiming the bridge contained virtually no U.S. content, Carney dismantled this claim point by point. American steel was used extensively on the Michigan side, confirmed by both local records and statements from Windsor's Mayor Drew Dilkins. American union workers spent 6 years building the bridge alongside their Canadian counterparts. The 2012 agreement explicitly required that all iron and steel be sourced from the United States or Canada. Claiming there was no U.S. involvement wasn't an interpretation, it was factually false. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer reinforced the point, emphasizing that American hands built the bridge and that blocking it would directly harm local workers. Trump's statement was not just incorrect, it was an insult to the labor force that made the project a reality. The fourth and final demand revolved around an alleged waiver granted by the Obama administration that allowed Canada to circumvent U.S. regulations. Carney's response exposed another layer of misunderstanding. The 2012 crossing agreement, negotiated under Republican Governor Rick Snyder, clearly required that iron and steel be produced in the United States or Canada. The presidential permit issued by Obama in 2013 was a standard regulatory process required for every cross-border infrastructure project. There was no waiver, no loophole, and certainly no violation of U.S. law. Yet, Trump's claim blamed a Democratic president for an agreement negotiated and signed by a Republican governor, revealing a fundamental misreading of the facts. Then came the most powerful moment of the press conference. Carney closed the folder, looked directly into the cameras, and summarized with icy precision. The president is demanding ownership of an asset his country already co-owns, compensation for costs it never incurred, and credit for materials it already supplied, all while misattributing the legal agreement to the wrong political figure. Every demand was already satisfied by the contract. The room went silent. Every journalist in the room understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A prime minister methodically proving, using only a 1-4-page contract, that the leader of the world's most powerful nation had made demands without even reading the governing document. Carney didn't raise his voice or use dramatic flair. He didn't need to. His offer to mail the president a copy of the contract, the very contract his country had signed, was a line so polite yet devastating that it perfectly encapsulated the entire confrontation. Canada had built the bridge, Canada had paid for it, and Canada would open it on schedule. The question wasn't whether the bridge would open, it was whether the president would be present on his side when it did, or whether he would be the only person attempting to obstruct it. The press conference ended. No questions were taken. The contract was left on the podium, a physical proof of reality that no amount of rhetoric could overturn. 72 hours later, the White House still had no substantive response. Not one rebuttal addressed the ownership point, the cost point, the materials point, or the Obama waiver claim. Trump's social media moved on, leaving the bridge entirely unmentioned. 3 separate drafts of a response were abandoned because each one could only confirm what Carney had already stated. You cannot argue with a contract that sits in front of 14 cameras, bookmarked and open to the relevant sections. Receipts and contracts do not negotiate, they exist as incontrovertible proof, and in this instance, the proof was unmistakable. The Gordy How Bridge was Canada's investment, co-owned by Michigan, built by American and Canadian labor, and the U.S. had received extraordinary benefits entirely for free. And then came Warren Buffett, whose words transformed the entire confrontation into a simple lesson on ownership, investment, and leverage. Buffett, speaking at a Berkshire Hathaway investors briefing, leaned forward, removed his glasses, and explained with the blunt clarity that has made him a trusted voice in finance for 7 decades. I've been buying companies for 70 years, he said, and I have never once walked into a closing table and demanded ownership of an asset I didn't pay for. In Buffett's world, ownership is earned, not claimed. You invest capital, take on risk, and build equity over time. You don't get shares simply by showing up or by making demands. And yet, that is exactly what the president had attempted with the Gordy How International Bridge. Canada invested $6.4 billion. The United States invested nothing. Michigan already co-owns half of the bridge as a gift of Canadian generosity. To demand more than what you've received for free isn't negotiation, it's entitlement masquerading as leverage. Buffett went further, drawing a line between leverage and mere demands. Leverage works when you control something the other party cannot get elsewhere, when walking away would cost them more than conceding. But what leverage does the U.S. have on this bridge? None. The agreement is signed, construction is nearly complete, the port of entry has been officially recognized by the Department of Homeland Security, and Canada holds the receipt. No threats, no political maneuvering, no social media posts changes that reality. Making demands without leverage is performance, not negotiation. And Carney's act of holding the contract for all to see was the ultimate rebuttal. He wasn't negotiating, he was showing proof. And proof, unlike rhetoric, doesn't negotiate back. Buffett's point was clear. Equity comes from investment, not performance or political grandstanding. Canada invested $6.4 billion, the U.S. invested $0. The equity distribution reflects this reality. No amount of demanding, no amount of posturing for cameras, no amount of misattributing agreements to political opponents changes the arithmetic. Carney understood this intuitively and methodically, which is why the confrontation collapsed so completely. From a business perspective, this was a failure of due diligence. From a diplomatic perspective, it was an embarrassment so stark it reverberated across North America. Carney didn't need strategy or maneuvering. He simply read the contract, presented the numbers, and let the arithmetic speak for itself. The bridge became more than just steel and concrete. It became a mirror reflecting the broader U.S.-Canada dynamic and the administration's approach to negotiations. Trump's method loud demands, assumptions that the other side won't check, and performance for the cameras works sometimes with nations that lack the institutional capacity or fear economic retaliation. But it fails spectacularly when the other side has a contract and the expertise to read it. Carney brought the homework, and volume lost to documentation every single time. Ownership, costs, labor, materials, everything Trump demanded was already settled in a 1-4-page document signed by a Republican governor more than a decade ago. All that was needed was to read it. The implications in Michigan were immediate and bipartisan. This was not a partisan spat. It was a state with a vested interest in the bridge and its economic benefits standing up to factual inaccuracies. Republican former Governor Rick Snyder, who negotiated and signed the 2012 agreement, publicly confirmed that Michigan co-owns the bridge, that American workers built it, and that the deal was good for both Michigan and the United States. Democratic Governor Whitmer echoed the sentiment. 12,000 jobs depend on this crossing. American labor built it, and blocking it would sabotage the state's workforce. Even members of Congress, both Republican and Democratic, united in defense of the bridge, with legislation introduced to protect it from any potential presidential interference. The business community in Detroit, fully aware of the economic stakes, counted down to the bridge's scheduled opening with urgency that crossed party lines. When leaders from both parties say the president is objectively wrong on the facts, this is no longer politics. It is arithmetic and reality asserting themselves against incorrect claims. Then there was the shadow over the entire episode. Why make these demands at all when every fact contradicts them? The Ambassador Bridge, a 7-year-old, privately owned, 4-lane structure that monopolized Detroit-Windsor truck traffic, was about to lose its dominance. Traffic was already declining as shippers anticipated the new Gordy How Bridge. The bridge's owners, the Moran family, had spent over $30 million in 2012 trying to block construction through a ballot initiative which ultimately failed. Now, as the Gordy How approached completion, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick met with the bridge owners just hours before Trump's demands surfaced. A congressional investigation was launched, raising questions about who might benefit from delays or attempts to block the bridge issues intertwined with campaign contributions and monopoly protection. Yet, despite these investigations, the core factual question was already answered. Canada paid for the bridge, the U.S. received half ownership, 12,000 jobs, and a world-class port of entry entirely free. The president's demands for compensation and credit for costs already covered, ownership already granted, and materials already provided were objectively false. After Carney's press conference, the silence from the White House spoke louder than any statement could. 72 hours passed and not a single substantive response emerged. There was no rebuttal on ownership because Michigan already co-owns half. No rebuttal on cost because the U.S. paid nothing. No rebuttal on materials because American steel and labor were integral. No rebuttal on the so-called Obama waiver because the agreement was signed by a Republican governor under standard procedures. Trump's communications team reportedly drafted 3 separate responses and abandoned all of them because each would have required confirming the very facts they wanted to dispute. The reality was unavoidable. You cannot argue with a receipt, you cannot dispute a contract sitting on a podium in front of 14 cameras, and you cannot refute arithmetic. All that remained was pretending the facts didn't exist, changing the topic, or remaining silent, and silence is exactly what they chose. This episode highlights a crucial lesson in both diplomacy and business. Showing up and demanding doesn't replace understanding, preparation, or investment. The Gordy How International Bridge, a $6.4 billion investment by Canada, co-owned by Michigan, employing thousands of American and Canadian workers, and built to modernize the busiest trade corridor between two nations, cannot be commandeered simply by insistence. The bridge is a testament to what happens when meticulous planning, contracts, and accountability meet unsupported demands. Mark Carney held up the contract, and that simple act demolished a set of claims that had no factual basis. Every nation negotiating with the U.S. now saw the same lesson. Volume, theatrics, and assumptions lose instantly against documentation, contracts, and facts. Homework reading the agreement, understanding the obligations, checking the numbers is the most powerful weapon in modern diplomacy, and Carney wielded it flawlessly. The bipartisan reaction in Michigan was immediate and unanimous. Snyder and Whitmer, Republican and Democrat, together confirmed that the state co-owns the bridge, that American workers built it, and that blocking it would sabotage thousands of jobs. Congress, both parties, and the Detroit business community rallied to defend the bridge, emphasizing that the project's economic and strategic importance transcends political divisions. The Gordy How will open on schedule in March 2026, and the Department of Homeland Security's ruling officially establishes it as a U.S. port of entry. The political and economic consequences of attempting to block or interfere with a bridge in a swing state are immense. Yet, the president has three options: accept the agreement, attempt to obstruct at his own political peril, or quietly move on and hope the event fades from memory. The arithmetic, the facts, and the contract leave no room for misinterpretation. Ownership comes from investment, not from demands, threats, or theatrics. This bridge, in all its engineering brilliance and economic significance, serves as a mirror to broader U.S.-Canada relations and a stark example of how not to conduct international negotiations. Trump's approach, aggressive demands, assumptions of compliance, and performance over homework fails spectacularly when faced with a partner armed with facts, contracts, and documentation. The Gordy How International Bridge is proof that preparation, diligence, and respect for agreements prevail over bluster and assumptions. It's a $6.4 billion receipt, a monument to what investment and cooperation look like, and a cautionary tale of what happens when demands ignore reality. The numbers are immutable. Canada paid $6.4 billion, the U.S. paid zero, and yet the U.S. received half ownership, thousands of jobs, and access to a world-class port of entry. The president's demands were unnecessary, unearned, and unfounded. Carney's method was simple, yet devastating. Read the contract, show the numbers, present the facts. Nothing more was needed. 72 hours of White House silence, abandoned drafts, and muted social media coverage all underline one clear truth: you cannot negotiate with arithmetic. You cannot claim what you did not invest in, and you cannot rewrite reality with performance or bluster. The Gordy How International Bridge will open, transforming North America's busiest trade corridor, while demonstrating the stark difference between entitlement and investment, performance and preparation, and assumption versus documentation. In the end, the lesson is simple. If you want equity, you earn it. If you want leverage, you create it. If you want reality to bend, you must first understand the facts. The contract is the argument, and in this case, the argument is over.